Right, I didn't really think I'd be posting this here because, well, I'm not one to share personal stuff online. But honestly, I don't know what else to do anymore. And if I don't get this out there, I'm afraid this guy's going to find me, or worse, do something that no one's going to be able to stop. So here it goes. I've always been one of those people who enjoys lurking on the internet, diving into the darker corners just for the thrill of it. You know, the morbid curiosity that gets the better of you. Well, a few months ago, I went down a rabbit hole that I seriously regret. And I'm not just talking about browsing some weird subreddits or conspiracy forums. I'm talking about the dark web. Yeah, I know, stupid idea, right? But back then, I didn't think much of it. I wasn't buying anything illegal. I wasn't even doing anything sketchy. I was just poking around, reading forums, seeing what people were talking about. Most of it was harmless. Well, as harmless as you'd expect for the dark web. People selling drugs, stolen credit cards, hitmen services, you know, the usual disturbing crap you hear about. But then I found something that I wasn't ready for. There was this thread titled, "Dark Web Stalker Real or Just a Myth?" It had tons of views and the comments were endless. People were debating whether this so-called dark web stalker was real or just some urban legend that got blown out of proportion. I wasn't really spooked at first. I mean, the internet's full of weird stories and fake horror crap, right? I figured it was just one of those, but then I started reading. And the details were messed up. According to what people were saying, this dark web stalker wasn't just some random guy spying on people through their webcams or like hacking into their social media accounts. No, this guy was on a whole different level. Apparently, if you even read about him, he'd find you. Some users claimed that they'd barely gotten through a few sentences of the thread before strange things started happening to them. People suddenly disappearing from their friends list, their internet connections acting weird, lights in their house flickering. And the creepiest part, they'd start getting pictures of themselves, pictures they never took. I know it sounds like some typical creepypasta shit, right? But the thread had so many people saying it happened to them, I started to feel uneasy. There were even screenshots of emails and text messages from random numbers with nothing but images of their front door, their backyard, places they thought were private. I didn't want to believe it, but I kept reading. I couldn't stop. And that's where I made my first mistake. I read the whole damn thing. People were going back and forth in the comments, some mocking it, saying it was all fake, and others swearing on their lives that they'd been targeted. The common thread was this: once the stalker started, he didn't stop. One guy claimed he got a photo of himself sleeping in his bed. He lived alone. Another one described hearing heavy breathing through his phone at night. And then there was a woman who said she got a video sent to her phone of her in the shower, filmed from inside her bathroom. And I won't lie, after reading all that, I started to get freaked out. It's one of those moments where you realize you've gone too far, but it's already too late. I shut my laptop, tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away, and that's when it started. The first night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of my phone buzzing. I checked it, groggy and half asleep, and saw a message from an unknown number. It was a picture of my bedroom door. I sat up so fast I nearly gave myself whiplash. I live in a small apartment and I always lock my door before bed. I remember getting up, shaking, and walking over to the door, checking the lock. It was still bolted, no signs of anyone being inside, but the angle of the picture, it was taken from inside my apartment. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone hacked my phone. Maybe they took an old picture of my door and somehow manipulated it. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized that didn't make sense. I'd never taken a picture like that. Hell, why would I? The next day, I thought about calling the cops, but what would I say? Hey, someone sent me a picture of my bedroom door. It sounded insane even to me. I tried to go about my day as normally as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That night, I made sure every door and window in my apartment was locked. I even put a chair in front of my bedroom door just to be safe. But when I woke up the next morning, my phone was buzzing again. Another message, another picture. This time it was a picture of me sleeping in my bed. That's when I lost it. I checked every inch of my apartment looking for cameras, bugs, anything that could explain how someone was taking these photos. I tore the place apart, but there was nothing. No signs of forced entry, no hidden devices, just me, freaking out, alone in my tiny apartment with a chair shoved under my door handle like some kind of pathetic attempt at security. I called my friend Chris, who's pretty tech-savvy, and told him what was going on. At first, he laughed it off, saying it was probably some sort of elaborate prank. But when I sent him the pictures, his tone changed. He offered to come over and help me figure it out, and I gladly took him up on it. When he arrived, we went through my place together. He checked my router, my phone, my laptop, everything. After a couple of hours, he told me he didn't find anything out of the ordinary, but he agreed it was weird as hell. The only suggestion he had was that maybe someone hacked my phone and was remotely accessing my camera. But when we checked my phone's data logs, there was no unusual activity. Nothing. That's when he asked, "Have you been on the dark web recently?" I froze. I told him about the thread, about the dark web stalker. His face got serious, and he told me to stop everything, disconnect from the internet, turn off my phone, cut all contact for a while and see if the messages stop. I was desperate, so I did it. I shut everything down. No phone, no laptop, no internet. For 2 days, I went completely off the grid. But it didn't stop. It got worse. On the third day, I woke up to my apartment feeling off. You ever get that feeling like someone's been in your space while you weren't there? Everything looked the same, but something felt different. I shrugged it off as paranoia until I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a post-it note stuck to my fridge. In my handwriting, it said, "I see you." My legs nearly gave out. I don't write notes to myself. Hell, I don't even own post-its. I felt the walls closing in like I was trapped in my own home with no way out. I had no idea how he got in, who he was, or how long he'd been watching me. That night, I barely slept. Every noise, every creak sent me into a panic. I swear I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I just lay there, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline, praying that this would end. But deep down, I knew it was just the beginning. All right, so where was I? Oh, right, the post-it note. That damn thing sent me into a full-blown panic attack. I remember just standing there staring at it, feeling like my whole world was crashing down. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even hold my phone. I felt like I was going crazy. But here's the thing. I knew I didn't write that note. I started second-guessing everything. I mean, I didn't even own post-its, right? I checked my drawers, my kitchen cabinets, my desk, everywhere. No post-it pads, nothing. It was like whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, trying to get inside my head, making me question reality itself. I didn't know what to do next. I was terrified to stay in my apartment, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. I couldn't go to my parents. They lived hours away. And I wasn't about to tell them about all this. My friends? Yeah, they'd think I'd lost it, especially after how Chris reacted when he came over the first time. And going to the cops, I mean, what was I going to say? Hey, there's a guy stalking me, but I don't know who he is, where he's coming from, or how he's getting into my apartment. I did the only thing I could think of. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and got the hell out of there. I didn't even have a plan. I just needed to get away. I ended up driving around for hours, aimlessly, just trying to clear my head. I didn't know where to go, so I pulled into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, paid in cash, and checked in under a fake name. It felt paranoid, but at that point, paranoia was all I had. The first night in the motel, I barely slept. The room was musty, and the bed felt like it was made of bricks, but none of that mattered. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear a creak or a shuffle outside the door, and I'd snap awake, my heart racing. But every time I checked, the hallway was empty. Morning came, and I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My eyes were bloodshot, and my nerves were shot. But for a few hours, nothing happened. No weird texts, no pictures, no notes. For a moment, I actually thought maybe I'd outrun him, that maybe this guy didn't know where I was. But that sense of relief didn't last long. Around noon, I got a text from an unknown number. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. The message was just 2 words. Found you. I threw my phone across the room like it had burned me. How the hell did he know where I was? I'd been careful. I'd paid in cash. I didn't even check into the motel with my real name. I hadn't touched my phone since I left the apartment. I felt sick, like physically sick. I was shaking, pacing the room, trying to figure out what to do. But my mind was racing so fast I couldn't focus on anything. I called Chris again. This time I was straight up panicking. I told him everything, the note, the text, the motel. His reaction was a lot more serious this time. He told me to stay put, lock the door, and not leave the room until he got there. He'd drive over and help me figure this out. I was relieved, at least for a moment, but the next few hours were the longest of my life. Every time I heard someone walk by outside, I thought it was him. Every knock, every voice, every car engine made me jump. I felt like I was losing it. And then, just before Chris was supposed to arrive, there was a knock at my door. My heart stopped. I walked over, real slow, trying to stay quiet, and peeked through the peephole. There was no one there. I waited for what felt like forever, staring through the tiny glass, waiting for someone to show up, but nothing. Then I heard a soft scratching noise. It was coming from the other side of the door. My whole body froze. I couldn't breathe. I pressed my ear against the door and listened, and I could hear it. This faint, methodical scratching, like someone dragging their nails across the wood. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. I just stood there, frozen, listening to that sound until finally it stopped. For the next 10 minutes, I didn't move. I was too scared to even make a sound. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that I was just freaking out over nothing. But then I got another text. This time, it was a picture. It was a picture of my motel door, the one I was standing behind, the one I was too afraid to open. I lost it. I ran to the bathroom, locked myself in, and sat in the corner with my back to the wall, shaking like a leaf. I didn't care how stupid I looked. I just wanted to be anywhere but in that room. Chris showed up about 30 minutes later, banging on the door, shouting my name. I let him in, and the first thing he said was, "You look like shit, dude." Yeah, no kidding. He could see how freaked out I was, though, and his joking tone dropped pretty quick. I showed him the text, the picture. He went pale. He didn't even try to brush it off this time. I told him about the scratching at the door, but when he checked the hallway, there was no one there. He didn't find anything weird. No cameras, no signs that anyone had broken in. Nothing. It was like this guy was a ghost. Chris suggested we head back to his place. It was safer, he said. He lived in a gated apartment complex with security cameras, the whole deal. Plus, I didn't feel safe staying in that motel any longer. So I agreed. We got in his car and drove to his place. But the whole ride there, I couldn't stop checking my phone. I kept waiting for the next message, the next picture, but nothing came. It was almost worse than getting another text. It was like waiting for the other shoe to drop. When we finally got to Chris's apartment, I felt a little better. The place was way more secure than mine, and he had a roommate, which made me feel less alone. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that this guy wasn't done with me yet. And of course, I was right. That night, Chris and I were sitting in his living room, trying to distract ourselves with some mindless TV. We didn't talk much about what was going on. It was too heavy, too real. But it was always there, lurking in the back of our minds. Around midnight, I got up to go to the bathroom, and when I came back, Chris was sitting there staring at his phone with a look on his face that I'll never forget. He turned the screen towards me. It was a picture of me standing in the bathroom, looking at myself in the mirror. The thing is, I hadn't taken my phone into the bathroom. The picture wasn't taken by me. I think that's when it really hit both of us. This wasn't just some tech-savvy creep with a grudge. This was something else, something neither of us could explain. Chris didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. We were just two guys sitting in his apartment staring at this photo that shouldn't exist, wondering how the hell someone could have taken it. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that picture, me, standing there, completely unaware that someone was watching me. I didn't even know if I was safe in Chris's place. The guy had found me at the motel, so what was stopping him from finding me here? The worst part? I started hearing that scratching again, except this time it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the walls. All right, so I know what you're probably thinking. This has to be some kind of prank, right? Like maybe Chris was in on it, or maybe I was just losing my mind from sleep deprivation or stress or whatever. Believe me, I wish that were the case. I've spent the past few weeks trying to convince myself that none of this is real, that there's some rational explanation for what's happening. But after what went down at Chris's place, I can't. There's just no denying it anymore. So I left off with the scratching sounds, right? That night at Chris's place, everything seemed like it was going to be okay. His apartment was way more secure than mine, like I said. And for a little while, I actually felt safe. I mean, there were security cameras, gates, neighbors nearby. It felt like this guy, whoever the hell he was, wouldn't be able to get to me there. But the scratching, man, that was the beginning of everything really spiraling out of control.
It started slow at first, almost like the sound of an animal or something crawling through the walls. I didn't even notice it at first. Chris was still awake, flipping through channels on the TV, and I was on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to get my mind to shut off. I thought maybe it was just the building settling or something, old pipes maybe. You know how places like that make weird noises. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became that this wasn't just some random house noise. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was too deliberate, too persistent. It was this constant, steady scratching, like someone was dragging their fingernails along the inside of the walls, inch by inch. And the worst part, it was moving. Like I could hear it shifting around, like it was circling the room, slowly getting closer to me. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to freak Chris out, and to be honest, I didn't want to admit that I was freaked out either. But after a few minutes, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound was getting louder, more intense, and it was starting to sound like it was coming from right behind my head. I sat up and glanced over at Chris, hoping maybe he heard it too. His eyes were locked on the TV, but I could see the tension in his face. He wasn't watching whatever dumb show was playing. He was listening. "Chris," I whispered, trying not to sound as scared as I was. "Do you hear that?" He didn't look at me, just nodded real slow. "Yeah, man, I hear it." That's when I knew this wasn't in my head. It wasn't some figment of my imagination. Chris was hearing it too. I got up from the couch and walked over to the wall where the sound seemed the loudest. My heart was racing, and my skin felt like it was crawling, but I had to know. I pressed my ear against the wall, and as soon as I did, I regretted it. The scratching stopped for a second. Silence. But then, there was this thud, like someone was pounding on the other side of the wall. I jumped back, stumbling over my own feet, and Chris shot up from the chair, eyes wide. "What the fuck was that?" he asked, his voice cracking like a little kid's. He wasn't laughing anymore. He wasn't trying to act tough. He was as freaked out as I was. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there staring at the wall, waiting for the next sound. But instead of scratching or pounding, something even worse happened. My phone buzzed. I was standing right next to it, so I grabbed it without thinking. Another message. But this time it wasn't just a picture. It was a video. I opened it, my stomach in knots, dreading what I was about to see. The video was grainy, like it had been shot on a cheap, low-quality camera, but it didn't take me long to figure out what I was looking at. It was us, me and Chris, sitting in his living room, right now. The video had been recorded from inside the apartment. My hands started shaking so bad I nearly dropped the phone. I showed it to Chris and he went pale. I could see him trying to make sense of it, like he was mentally retracing every step we'd taken since I got there. Neither of us had touched our phones since we got to his place. No one else had been in the apartment. But the video was undeniable. It showed both of us, right there, just moments ago. The worst part was the angle. The camera was positioned from inside the walls. Chris immediately started tearing through the place, flipping over furniture, opening cabinets, looking for any kind of hidden camera. I was right there with him, pulling open drawers, checking vents, ripping apart everything we could. But we found nothing, not a damn thing. That's when Chris started to panic for real. I mean, I'd been on edge since the motel, but this was the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. He started mumbling under his breath, pacing back and forth, his hands pulling at his hair like he was trying to rip it out. "What the fuck, what the fuck, what the fuck?" he kept repeating, his voice getting higher and more frantic. I couldn't blame him. I was just as freaked out. More than freaked out, I was terrified. I told Chris we needed to get out of the apartment, go to a hotel or something. I didn't care where, just anywhere but there. But before we could leave, there was another knock at the door. Just like before, real soft. 3 knocks, almost like a polite knock. But this time, we didn't rush to answer it. We stood there, frozen, staring at the door like it was some kind of ticking time bomb. The knocking came again, but a little louder. Chris looked at me, his face pale, and for a second, I thought he was going to cry. Then, before either of us could move, my phone buzzed again. Another message. This time the text said, "Open the door."
I didn't want to. Hell, I didn't even want to be in the same room as that door, but something in me, a mix of fear and adrenaline, made me grab the handle. I motioned for Chris to stand back, and I slowly opened the door, just a crack. The hallway was empty. No one was there. No footsteps, no sounds of anyone walking away. Just an empty, dimly lit corridor. But then, I noticed something on the ground. There was a small envelope, just lying there at my feet, with my name written on it in messy, almost childlike handwriting. My heart was racing as I bent down to pick it up. Chris was standing behind me, muttering under his breath, telling me not to open it, but I couldn't help myself. I tore it open with shaking hands, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The note said, "I'm inside." I dropped the note, my hands slick with sweat. Inside where? The apartment? The building? Inside the walls? I didn't have time to think about it. At that moment, the lights in the apartment flickered, just for a second, but long enough for both of us to notice. Chris grabbed my arm and practically dragged me towards the door. "We need to go. Now." We bolted. We didn't even bother packing anything. We just grabbed our keys and ran out of the building like our lives depended on it. And honestly, I think they did. I remember running down the stairs, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the stairwell, my chest tightening with every breath. It was like a nightmare, like no matter how fast we ran, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was chasing us. We got to Chris's car and peeled out of there, not saying a word the entire time. I don't even remember where we were going. We just drove, speeding down empty streets, both of us too scared to look back. After what felt like hours, we finally pulled into a 24-hour diner parking lot, breathing like we'd just run a marathon. We sat there in silence, both of us trying to catch our breath. Chris looked at me, his face pale, eyes wide. "Dude, we need to go to the cops. This is serious." I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. I mean, what were the cops going to do? What could they do? There was no sign of forced entry, no physical evidence, just creepy pictures and videos and weird noises. But before I could respond, my phone buzzed again. Another text. This one was different, though. It wasn't a picture. It wasn't a video. It was just a single line of text, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. You can't run from me. So, we were sitting in Chris's car in that diner parking lot, my hands shaking as I stared at my phone. That last text, "You can't run from me," felt like a punch to the gut. It was like this guy was in my head, like he already knew every move I was going to make before I even made it. Chris kept saying we should go to the cops, but I couldn't focus on anything except that damn message. I didn't respond to it. I wasn't sure if I should. I mean, what do you even say to something like that? Chris was still freaking out, pacing around the car, talking about getting out of town, going to stay with his brother in the next state over. But I knew deep down that it wouldn't matter. This guy wasn't just some random stalker. He had already found me twice, and both times I thought I was safe. We eventually went inside the diner because sitting in the car just felt exposed. Plus, I needed some caffeine to calm my nerves. The place was almost empty, just a couple of truckers sitting at the counter and a waitress who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Chris ordered coffee, and I sat there staring at the table, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. That's when Chris's phone buzzed. At first, he didn't even check it. He was in the middle of talking about how we should leave our phones behind and go off the grid for a while. Maybe even ditch our cars, get burner phones, the whole deal. But then it buzzed again and again. Finally, he pulled it out of his pocket, and when he looked at the screen, his face went white. He didn't say anything, just slid the phone across the table to me, his hand trembling. The messages were from the same unknown number that had been sending me pictures. There were 3 texts, all sent in rapid succession. The first one was a picture of us, sitting in the car outside the diner, both of us staring straight ahead, looking like we were in shock. It was taken just minutes ago. The second one was a picture of us inside the diner, sitting exactly where we were right now. The photo showed Chris with his phone in his hand, the exact same expression he was wearing at that moment. But it was the third message that really messed me up. It wasn't a picture this time, it was a video, just like the one I'd gotten before. I hesitated for a second, then hit play.
The video started with a shot of us, exactly as we were now. Me sitting there with my hands clasped, staring at the phone, Chris with his hand over his mouth, looking like he was on the verge of a breakdown. But then the camera panned, slowly, to the corner of the diner. There was a man standing there. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even looking at us. He was just standing there, facing the wall. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like his neck was broken or something. He was wearing a dark hoodie, and his hands were stuffed into his pockets, but something about the way he was standing, completely still, almost frozen, made my skin crawl. The video ended with the camera zooming in on the back of his head, no sound, no movement. Just the man standing there, staring at the wall like he was waiting for something. I looked up from the phone and immediately started scanning the diner. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew what I was about to see. Sure enough, in the far corner, right where the video had shown him, was the man in the hoodie. My heart stopped. Chris followed my gaze and froze, his eyes wide. Holy shit! Dude, that's him! That's him! I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. The guy still wasn't moving. He didn't even seem to notice us, but I knew that wasn't the case. He knew exactly where we were. He was waiting. I leaned in closer to Chris, whispering, "We need to get out of here, now." Chris nodded, and we slowly, carefully slid out of the booth. I kept my eyes on the guy the whole time, praying that he wouldn't turn around. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. As we made our way to the door, I expected him to follow us, but he didn't. He just stood there, perfectly still, like a statue. We practically sprinted to the car. Chris fumbled with his keys, dropping them twice before finally getting the door unlocked. We jumped in, slammed the doors, and peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the guy sprinting after us, but he never appeared. We were speeding down the highway, my hands gripping the edge of the seat so hard my knuckles were white. I could feel the panic rising in me, my breath coming in quick gasps, but I forced myself to stay calm. Chris was already freaking out enough for the both of us. "What the fuck was that?" he shouted, gripping the steering wheel so tight his hands were shaking. "How the hell does he keep finding us?" I didn't have an answer. None of this made sense. No matter where we went, no matter how far we ran, this guy always seemed to be one step ahead. And it wasn't just that he was watching us, he was inside our lives, inside our minds. We drove for hours, not saying much, just trying to get as far away as possible. We ended up in a different part of the state, in some rundown, half-abandoned town that felt like it was straight out of a horror movie. There wasn't much there, just a gas station, a couple of motels, and a creepy-looking convenience store with flickering neon lights. We pulled into one of the motels and got a room, paying cash again. The place was even sketchier than the last one, but we didn't care. At this point, it didn't feel like there were any safe options left. We just needed to hide. Once we got inside the room, I threw my phone onto the bed like it was radioactive. I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. Chris did the same, pacing around the room, running his hands through his hair, muttering to himself. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice cracking with fear. I didn't know. I honestly didn't. This wasn't just some guy who'd found us on the internet. This was something bigger, something worse. And no matter what we did, it seemed like there was no escaping it. We decided to stay off our phones for the rest of the night. We didn't touch them, didn't even glance at them. Instead, we barricaded the door with a dresser and hunkered down, trying to make a plan. I kept the lights off, convinced that the darkness would somehow protect us, even though deep down I knew it wouldn't. A few hours passed and nothing happened. No knocks at the door, no weird noises, no messages. For the first time in what felt like forever, I started to think that maybe, just maybe, we'd finally shaken this guy. Then, at around 3 a.m., there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a loud knock. In fact, it was so soft I almost didn't hear it. But when it came again, I knew exactly who it was. Chris looked at me, his eyes wide, his face pale. "Don't open it," he whispered. I didn't need to be told twice, but the knocking kept coming. Tap, 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 always in threes, soft but insistent. Like whoever was on the other side knew we were in there and wasn't going to leave until we let them in. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. But instead of stopping, the knocks changed. They grew louder, more forceful, like whoever was out there was getting impatient. Bang! 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 We both jumped, my heart racing in my chest. The door rattled, but the dresser we'd shoved in front of it held firm. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. Silence. For a moment I thought maybe he'd left. But then I heard something that made my stomach drop. My phone buzzed. I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to know what the message said. But when Chris's phone buzzed too, I knew we had no choice. We grabbed our phones at the same time, glancing at the screens. We had both gotten the same message. "Look under the bed." I froze, my whole body going numb. Chris turned to me, his face pale as a ghost. Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly, Chris knelt down and peeked under the bed. I'll never forget the way he screamed. Chris's scream. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't just fear. It was the kind of scream that comes from deep inside, when your brain can't even process what you're seeing. It was pure terror, the kind of sound that makes your blood turn cold. I didn't want to look. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to stay back, to run, to get out of that room as fast as I could. But I couldn't leave Chris there, hunched over, shaking like a leaf, staring under the bed with that horrified expression on his face. I grabbed his arm, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode, and I forced myself to look. At first I didn't see anything. It was just dark under there, a shadowy space with dust and some crumpled wrappers. For a split second, I almost thought we were just losing it, that maybe this whole thing had been some kind of sick joke or a series of coincidences, but then I saw it. There, lying flat on the floor under the bed, was a man. No,
Not just a man. Him. The dark web stalker. The guy who'd been watching us, sending those photos, lurking in the shadows, was right there, under the bed the entire time. His body was twisted in this unnatural way, arms at his sides, his head tilted up at an impossible angle so that he was staring right at us with these cold, dead eyes. His mouth was slightly open, and there was this sick grin stretched across his face. But what freaked me out the most? He wasn't moving. He was just lying there, perfectly still, like some kind of deranged mannequin, as if he'd been waiting for us to find him all along. His chest wasn't rising, no signs of breathing, just that eerie, frozen stare. Chris scrambled back, crashing into the dresser behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I could barely move, my body frozen in place. I couldn't take my eyes off the guy under the bed. I was terrified that if I looked away, he'd move, that he'd grab me, drag me under with him. But he didn't. He just stayed there, watching us, like some kind of sick, twisted prank that had gone way too far. Then my phone buzzed again. I almost dropped it. My hands were shaking so badly. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what fresh hell this guy was about to unleash on us, but something made me check it anyway. The message was just 2 words. Look closer. I felt bile rise in my throat. My vision blurred for a second as the reality of the situation hit me full force. Chris was still in shock, shaking and mumbling to himself, but I couldn't let it go. I had to know. What was I supposed to see? What did he want me to look at? My legs were like jelly as I crouched down again, inching closer to the bed, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. I could feel the sweat pouring down my face, my hands clammy as I gripped the edge of the mattress. I leaned down, just enough to get a better look at the guy's face. And that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. His eyes, they weren't just staring at us. They were moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they followed every move I made. That twisted grin on his face stretched wider, and I realized with horror that he wasn't dead. He wasn't frozen. He was waiting. I shot back up, nearly falling over as I stumbled away from the bed. He's alive, I choked out. Chris's eyes went wide and he started backing toward the door, his entire body trembling. We didn't wait any longer. We bolted. We grabbed our stuff, threw the dresser aside, and raced out of the motel room, slamming the door behind us. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as we ran to the car. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following us.
Chris was shaking so hard he could barely get the car started. We screeched out of the parking lot, the tires spinning as we sped off down the empty road, the motel shrinking in the rearview mirror. Neither of us said a word. We were too scared, too overwhelmed to even process what had just happened. But as we drove, my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what that psychopath had sent me this time. But I had to. I had to know. The message was simple. You'll never escape. I threw the phone down, my hands shaking uncontrollably. We need to get rid of these, I muttered, more to myself than to Chris. We need to ditch our phones. This is how he's tracking us. This is how he's finding us. Chris just nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Yeah, we need to disappear. We need to go somewhere he can't follow. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't matter. No matter where we went, no matter what we did, this guy, this thing, wasn't going to stop. He wasn't just some hacker or stalker who'd gotten lucky. He was something else, something I couldn't explain, something beyond just technology or surveillance. We drove for hours that night, not really knowing where we were going. We ditched our phones at a gas station, throwing them in the trash before buying burner phones, but it didn't feel like enough. Nothing felt like enough. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him. Every dark corner, every shadow, every passing car felt like it could be him, lurking, waiting to strike. We ended up renting a cabin out in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any kind of town or city. It was isolated, quiet, exactly the kind of place where no one would be able to find us. For the first time in weeks, I actually started to feel a tiny bit of relief. I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd finally gotten away from him. But then, on the second night, it started again. Chris and I were sitting in the cabin, trying to distract ourselves with TV when we heard it. The scratching. Faint at first, barely audible over the noise of the TV, but unmistakable. That same, slow, deliberate sound we'd heard before, only this time, it was coming from inside the cabin. I looked at Chris, and he looked at me, and we both knew. We hadn't escaped. We hadn't outrun him. He was here. The scratching grew louder, more intense, and then the lights flickered, just like they had in Chris's apartment. The air around us seemed to thicken, like the room itself was closing in on us, and I knew we were trapped. My phone buzzed again. I hadn't even given the number to anyone. It was a burner phone, but somehow he had it. I looked down at the screen, my heart sinking as I read the message. "I'm inside." We didn't have time to react. The door to the cabin slammed open, and the lights went out completely. For a moment, there was only darkness. And then, in the pitch black, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer and closer. I grabbed Chris's arm, pulling him toward the back door, but before we could get there, we heard it. That laugh. It was low, guttural, barely more than a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. It was coming from the darkness, from right behind us. We froze, too terrified to move, and then the scratching started again, this time from the walls all around us. It was like we were surrounded, like the walls themselves were alive, crawling with that sound, closing in on us. I turned toward the open door, my heart racing, ready to make a run for it, but then I saw him. Standing in the doorway, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moonlight, was the Stalker. His face was still twisted in that sick grin, his eyes wide, unblinking, staring straight at me. I don't know what happened next. I don't know if we ran, if we fought, or if we were just too terrified to do anything at all. All I know is that the last thing I remember was that smile, and then everything went black. I woke up the next morning, alone. No sign of Chris, no sign of the Stalker. Just me, lying in the middle of the cabin floor, drenched in sweat, my heart still racing. I checked my phone. No messages, no photos, nothing. It was like it never happened. But I know better. I know it's not over. I don't know where Chris is, I don't know where he is, but I know this isn't the end. I'm writing this now because if you're reading this, if you've made it this far, he knows about you too. Maybe you've heard about the dark web stalker before. Maybe you've dismissed it as just another internet horror story. But I'm telling you right now, he's real. And once you know about him, once you start reading about him, he knows you. So, if you get a message from an unknown number, if you hear scratching in the walls, if you see someone standing in the corner, don't ignore it. Don't try to rationalize it. Because no matter where you go, no matter how far you run, he's already inside.